Welcome to Compact Disasters from compacthistories.com, where we look at catastrophes, accidents, and natural disasters in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 70, the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster. Before it became synonymous with catastrophe, Lac-Mégantic was a small, close-knit town in the eastern townships of Quebec, Canada, with a population of just under 6,000. Set beside Lac-Mégantic itself, the lake after which the town was named, and surrounded by forests and low mountains, the town functioned as a regional hub for commerce, tourism, and light industry. Its centre was compact and walkable, with cafes, shops, and apartments clustered close to the railway line that cut directly through the downtown area. The railway had long been part of Lac-Mégantic's identity. Built in the late 19th century, the line connected rural Quebec with Maine and the wider North American rail network. For decades, it carried timber, manufactured goods, and modest freight, alongside passenger services in earlier years. By the early 21st century, passenger trains were gone, but freight traffic remained a routine, largely uncontroversial presence in daily life. That began to change in the late 2000s with the rapid expansion of North American oil production, particularly from the Bakken Shale Formation in North Dakota. As oil output surged, pipeline capacity failed to keep pace. Rail emerged as a flexible alternative, capable of moving large volumes of crude oil quickly across long distances. Unit trains carrying oil became longer, heavier, and more frequent, passing through towns that had never previously handled such hazardous cargo. Lac-Mégantic sat directly on one of these routes. Trains operated by the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway, MMA, carried crude oil from North Dakota through Quebec and into the United States. The line's geography meant that loaded trains descended a long gradient toward the town centre, passing through sharp curves before continuing east. Despite this, there was no bypass. Oil trains rolled straight through the heart of town, meters from homes, businesses, and public spaces. Regulation struggled to keep pace with the changing risk. Crude oil was often classified as less volatile than it truly was. Tank car standards lagged behind known safety concerns, and operating practices placed heavy responsibility on individual crews rather than layered safety systems. In Lac-Mégantic, these broader trends were largely invisible. Residents were aware of increased rail traffic, but had little reason to believe it posed an exceptional danger. By the summer of 2013, Lac-Mégantic was a town living alongside infrastructure it had always known, now quietly transformed by an energy boom far beyond its borders. The conditions for disaster were not dramatic or sudden. They were structural, incremental, and embedded in the everyday movement of trains through a place that had never been designed to absorb their consequences. On the evening of Friday, the 5th of July 2013, a freight train operated by MMA was en route from North Dakota to an oil refinery in New Brunswick. The train consisted of 72 DOT-111 tank cars carrying Bakken crude oil, pulled by 5 locomotives and a buffer car. A single engineer crewed it, a cost-saving practice permitted at the time, but one that concentrated responsibility in a single pair of hands. Shortly before 11 p.m., the train stopped for the night on the main line near the village of Nantes, approximately 11 kilometres uphill from Lac-Mégantic. The engineer set the handbrakes, shut down several locomotives to reduce noise complaints, and left the train unattended, as was standard practice. What mattered was not that the train was parked, but how it was secured. MMA rules required a sufficient number of handbrakes to be applied and tested. The engineer applied 7 handbrakes, later judged to be insufficient for the weight and gradient of the train. Compounding this, the effectiveness of the brakes was tested with air pressure still applied, masking the fact that the handbrakes alone could not hold the train. At 11:40 p.m., a fire broke out in one of the lead locomotives, likely due to an oil leak in the engine. Local firefighters responded and extinguished the blaze. As part of standard procedure, they shut down the locomotive entirely. This action had unintended consequences. With the engine shut down, the air compressor stopped, and air pressure in the braking system gradually bled off. Over the next hour, as air pressure dissipated, the inadequate handbrakes were left as the sole restraint. They could not hold the train on the descending grade. At approximately 12:56 a.m. on the 6th of July, the train began to move. Slowly at first, then accelerating as gravity took over, the unattended consist rolled downhill toward Lac-Mégantic. No alarm sounded. No crew was present to intervene. What followed was not a single failure, but a sequence of small, individually survivable decisions that aligned catastrophically. By the time the runaway train reached the outskirts of town, it was travelling at highway speed, carrying a volatile cargo into a place that was asleep and entirely unprepared. At 1:14 a.m., the unattended MMA freight train reached the centre of Lac-Mégantic. By this point, the 72-car consist had been rolling downhill for several kilometres, accelerating to an estimated speed of over 100 kilometres per hour. As it entered the sharp curve in the downtown area, the train derailed almost immediately. 63 of the tank cars left the tracks. Many ruptured on impact, releasing tens of thousands of litres of Bakken crude oil into the surrounding streets and buildings. Within seconds, the vapour ignited. A series of massive explosions followed, sending fireballs into the night sky and producing intense heat that was felt hundreds of metres away. The blasts destroyed the core of the town. Buildings along Frontenac Street, including bars, cafes, shops and apartments, were engulfed. Some structures were obliterated entirely, reduced to twisted metal and ash. Others burned for hours as oil-fed fires raged uncontrollably. The derailment created a burning crater where the tracks had been, and flaming oil flowed into basements, sewers, and nearby waterways. Most of the victims were inside buildings near the tracks when the explosions occurred. The disaster killed 47 people, many of them patrons and staff in late-night venues. Several bodies were never recovered intact due to the intensity of the fire. The explosions also released thick plumes of toxic smoke, forcing residents to flee in darkness and confusion. Emergency services faced immediate and overwhelming challenges. The heat was so intense that firefighters could not approach the derailment site for hours. Water supplies were inadequate for a fire of this magnitude, and mutual aid had to be requested from surrounding communities and across the US border. Evacuations were ordered for thousands of residents as the fire continued to burn through the morning. In the minutes after the derailment, Lac-Mégantic was overwhelmed by fire. Burning crude oil spread rapidly through the town centre, igniting buildings block by block and creating temperatures too extreme for firefighters to approach. The initial explosions had already destroyed water mains and power lines, complicating any immediate response. Thick, toxic smoke filled the air, and visibility dropped to near zero in some streets. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but were forced to operate at a distance. Firefighters focused first on evacuating residents rather than extinguishing the blaze, recognizing that the oil-fed fires could not be controlled with standard equipment. Police went door to door in the surrounding neighborhoods, ordering people to leave immediately. Many residents fled on foot in the middle of the night, some still in nightclothes, unsure whether family members or neighbors had escaped. By dawn, more than 2,000 people, roughly a third of the town's population, had been evacuated. Temporary shelters were set up in nearby communities, including schools and community centres. Families waited for news, often unable to contact loved ones as mobile networks were overwhelmed or offline. The sense of dislocation was profound. Lac-Mégantic's centre, the social and economic heart of the town, was burning uncontrollably. The recovery of victims was slow and emotionally devastating. The intensity of the fire meant that search operations could not begin until the blaze was largely extinguished, which took several days. When crews were finally able to enter the derailment zone, they found scenes of near-total destruction. Some victims were identified only through DNA analysis, personal effects, or fragments recovered from the debris. The final death toll was confirmed as 47. Environmental damage compounded the human tragedy. Thousands of litres of oil were spilt into the Chaudière River and Lac-Mégantic Lake, contaminating water and soil. Booms and vacuum systems were deployed to limit the spread, but the ecological impact was immediate and severe. Fish and wildlife were killed, and drinking water supplies had to be closely monitored. For residents, the immediate aftermath blurred into shock, grief, and exhaustion. The disaster had not only taken lives, but also erased workplaces, homes, and familiar streets in a single night. Lac-Mégantic was safe from further explosions by the end of the 6th of July, but the town that emerged from the smoke was fundamentally changed, facing a long recovery from a trauma that had unfolded while it slept. In the aftermath of the Lac-Mégantic disaster, investigations began almost immediately at multiple levels of government. The scale of the loss, 47 deaths, and the destruction of a town centre demanded a full accounting of how a single freight train had been allowed to run away unchecked. What emerged was a picture of systemic failure rather than one isolated mistake. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada, TSB, led the primary technical investigation. Its findings, released in 2014, identified a chain of causes: insufficient handbrakes, inadequate brake testing, poor maintenance of the lead locomotive, weak oversight, and operating practices that relied heavily on a single crew member. The TSB concluded that the MMA had a deficient safety culture and that Transport Canada's regulatory oversight had been ineffective. Criminal responsibility was also pursued. In 2013, Quebec prosecutors laid criminal negligence charges against 3 MMA employees: the train engineer, the railway's operations manager, and its traffic controller. The case was closely watched, as it raised questions about whether frontline workers could be held criminally liable for failures rooted in corporate policy and regulatory gaps. In 2018, all 3 men were acquitted, with the court finding that responsibility extended beyond individual actions to systemic issues within the company. Corporate accountability followed a different path. MMA filed for bankruptcy protection in August 2013, limiting its financial liability. The company's chairman, Edward Burkhardt, faced intense criticism for cost-cutting measures, including single-person crews and deferred maintenance. While Burkhardt was never criminally charged, his leadership decisions became central to public debate about rail safety and profit-driven risk. Civil lawsuits resulted in settlements funded through a combination of insurance, government contributions, and industry support. In 2016, a compensation fund of approximately 460 million Canadian dollars was established for victims and the town, covering personal loss, environmental cleanup, and reconstruction. Lac-Mégantic exposed the difficulty of assigning responsibility in complex systems. Criminal courts struggled to individualize blame, while corporate structures shielded senior decision-makers. What the investigations made clear, however, was that the disaster was not unforeseeable. Risks associated with unsecured oil trains, volatile crude, and minimal staffing had been known. The tragedy lay not in ignorance, but in a system that allowed those risks to persist, unchecked. The Lac-Mégantic disaster forced a fundamental reassessment of how hazardous materials are moved by rail in Canada and beyond. In the years that followed, regulators, rail operators, and governments introduced reforms aimed at preventing a similar catastrophe, though debates over adequacy and enforcement continue. One of the most immediate changes involved train securement rules. New regulations required a greater number of handbrakes, stricter testing procedures, and additional safeguards when trains carrying dangerous goods are left unattended. Single-person crews on trains transporting hazardous materials were effectively phased out, recognizing that concentration of responsibility had been a critical vulnerability. Tank car standards were also overhauled. The DOT 111 tank cars involved in the derailment were widely criticized for their thin shells and susceptibility to puncture. Canada and the United States jointly mandated the gradual phase-out or retrofitting of these cars, replacing them with stronger designs featuring thicker steel, improved valves, and thermal protection. While this transition reduced risk, it took years to complete, during which oil-by-rail shipments continued. Oversight and transparency increased. Transport Canada expanded inspection regimes and safety audits, while railways were required to share information with municipalities about the type and volume of hazardous materials moving through their communities. This marked a shift toward acknowledging that local authorities and residents had a right to understand the risks passing through their towns. Lac-Mégantic also reshaped urban planning. A new railway bypass was approved to reroute freight traffic away from the town centre, addressing a danger that had existed for generations. Rebuilding focused on memorialization as well as recovery, with public spaces designed to honour the victims while restoring civic life. Despite these reforms, Lac-Mégantic left unresolved questions. Oil continues to move by rail when pipelines are unavailable or politically contested. Cost pressures remain, and safety improvements rely on sustained regulatory vigilance rather than one-time fixes. The disaster demonstrated that catastrophic failure often emerges from ordinary operations, not extraordinary circumstances. The legacy of Lac-Mégantic is written into new rules, stronger tank cars, and changed practices. Yet its deeper lesson is more uncomfortable. Safety is not guaranteed by compliance alone. It requires continuous attention, institutional memory, and the willingness to intervene before a chain of small decisions gains momentum. In Lac-Mégantic, that chain ran downhill, unchecked, until it could no longer be stopped. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Disasters, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactdisasters.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, true crime, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/disasterscoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.